Hi everybody, welcome to the second lesson of our first module here in the second year of Renaissance Academy of Fine Arts. Today we are going to just look a little bit more into working from life. So today we're going to draw from 3 different sculptures. The first one, I'm at an art museum and I will be drawing a little white marble sculpture, a figure. And then the second one, I'm drawing a human skull because I really do feel that it's important to really just get in there and study and understand the contours and the bones of a skull, and I talk more about that in there. And then the last one I have a figurine of a white lion, so I'm drawing that one. So the idea is that you find items around your home, or if you're out and about, just sketch them. Get in the practice of drawing from your experiences, and that is the key of this lesson. All right, so when I approach a sculpture, wherever I am, at a museum or in my home or just at a park, I decide on an angle that I like best, and I don't move from that place. So I begin by loosely mapping out the general location of where I want it to fit on my paper. And then in this case, I had this beautiful white marble sculpture, and I just loosely got the gesture of it, so I knew that it was going to fit within the boundaries of that rectangle. So then once I had that in place, I started just calculating the head is about this high, and then just work my way down. These are a little bit like plein air studies. So it's not so much about getting it perfect as it is about creating and capturing a moment. So in this case, I figured out where the head's going to go, and I really wanted to work on capturing this graceful movement of her form, and so I got that in place. And I am mapping out now, just with my sharpened pencil, a little bit more accuracy around her arm and chest, trying to get those passages in there to really look like they have an anatomical understanding, because the sculpture was so well done. I really wanted to make sure that I captured that in the drawing. And I am just using a very cheap mechanical pencil at this point because it had, it just kind of maintains a sharp point, and I like the darker lead than what I had on hand. I'm also squinting down at my image and the sculpture and just trying to isolate where I see the darkest values, and then working on just creating a general feeling of value mass. So this darker passage around her torso, I just put a thin layer of value over that, and then I'm using the color of the paper, the toned paper, as my middle tone value. And then over the top of that, then I will pop in a few highlights. I do have a few accents on there already, just to help sort of guide my focus and direction where I want the extremes to go. Just suggesting her face in there, just enough to give it the feeling of that she's looking down. The sculpture itself did not have a whole lot of detail, but it had just this elegant grace to the whole sculpture. And I appreciated the lack of detail, because sometimes more detail just makes it less interesting. So I wanted to sort of create that overall feeling in my drawing that the sculpture conveyed. And again, it's that's why it's similar to plein air, because you are trying to capture the essence of the subject that you are working on. While I was working on this drawing, all the time I was looking around at the entire sculpture, as well as using the negative space to help draw different elements of this. So behind her leg and about at the top there where the fabric comes down, you can see this the background shape. And so I was looking at that to help draw the line of that leg. Same with in between the two legs. There's sort of that D shape. And so I used that to help to try to get that angle accurate. And you can remember those lessons from our first year when we were discussing plumb lines and negative space and measuring and so forth. So those are all tools that hopefully by now, after having gone through year one, that you are quite comfortable with, at least in your arsenal of drawing tools, how to use those things to our advantage to capture a little bit more likeness of something as you're working. So now I am adding a thin layer of white. Most of the sculpture will receive some sort of white on it. There are places where I just want the cream color of the paper to show through, but because it is a white marble sculpture, I felt that it was more believable to have more white on there than the actual tan color of the paper. So I'm adding just a very thin layer of it, and then I'm reserving the most intense parts of white for the highlights. And just like in doing a plein air, you know you are finished with your drawing when you feel that it has arrived at the overall feeling that the original sculpture has. Okay, so now I'm going to be working on this toned paper with just my regular pencil, and I've got a white Conti pencil here, and I've got my eraser and sharpeners, so I'm all set. What I'm going to be doing is this skull, and I'm going to be working on this from life, and because I think it's always good to understand the anatomy of a skull. That way, if you ever have to work from your imagination, or if you have to, maybe there's a part of the person you're painting and it's hard to see, I think it's advisable to understand the anatomy. So I'm gonna try this from a few different angles and just sort of play with the idea of understanding this. I'm gonna leave the lower mandible off for now, just to kind of really focus on the eye cavity and see where we go from that. So I'm just eyeballing kind of as the forehead comes down like this. And I'm thinking I'll kind of fit this in about this area right here. So again, just like with anything else, keeping my initial markings very loose. And I'm looking at the subtle angles here as the bone comes down like this. Top of the eyes, this one's here, this one's about here. And you can draw, I mean, you don't have to do a skull. You can do whatever you happen to have around your home. We're going to be getting into plaster casts next week, and so that's a fun project, so I wouldn't recommend doing that one quite yet, whatever your plaster casts are. But sometimes people have sculptures sitting around. You could do figurines. Last year we talked quite a bit about drawing cylinders, cubes, and spheres, and that was a very valuable lesson, and hopefully carried you throughout the year with just different, referring back to those earlier lessons. Really zeroing in on this eye socket over here, and how I'm looking at the way that the brow bone right here turns, and then it comes down around to the zygomatic down below. And I'm using my pencil to show some of the form, just like I would with the paintbrush. So the skull has this roundness right here as the forehead comes around into the front. So I can use those lines to help suggest the turning of this forehead plane right here. And just like inside this eye socket, there's sort of that wall, the orbital wall inside here, inside the cavity. So if I use my pencil strokes to sort of define that form, that helps in that area, a little bit like that. Gives it that sense of this is like a cave. And then I'll pop in a sharper accent where I really want that to show some different area from that. And you can see how just by doing that, then all of a sudden it sort of pops out in front of that value that I created back in here. Okay, so now the ridge of the nose as it comes down this way, we have a sharper edge here, and then it levels out right here. So I'm going to use these pencil strokes like this to show the edge of this cavity over here. Like that. And you can do some vertical and then turn it and suggest the topography of this by allowing those pencil strokes to, as you can see how just by doing that, now all of a sudden this looks like a ridge that pops out from there. And when I put in this little highlight for the white, just to show that break in that. Now it really looks like it pops forward. Same with this eye socket cavity over there. Oops, a little bit right there. Okay, I don't want to get carried away with the white yet, because I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. Getting back to this passage here. Look, I'm looking at the negative space created by the zygomatic and the sinus cavity right here. And all of this is, I'm considering negative space compared to the bridge of the bone of the nose as it comes forward. Just looking at the shape of this too. There's this division line in here. Just want to get these angles here quite little more accurate. Sometimes I use a stiffer eraser. You can use, I've just got this mechanical pencil handy, so I'm just grabbing this. Okay, so now that is a white, very white ridge inside the nose, and I don't want to have it show up as a dark line. So I'm erasing that, and I'm only going to focus on the value around it. And same thing with over here. I think I'll push this value up here just a little bit darker too. Okay, and then now there's some value changes throughout this side of the entire cavity over here. So I'm going to focus on some of those right now. Just pulling out those pieces of information as I see them. So the bone, things like that. And sometimes I use just the tip of my pencil to create a sharper accent. Looking at the distance of this curve to the edge over here. And then the canine tooth bone starts way up here by the nose and is quite prominent. So I'm going to put a thin value of color over this over here just to show that this is over here in shadow. Okay, so my skull is missing a tooth, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in as though it's missing. I think that's kind of interesting. So there's some value coming down from the nose here for the teeth ridges, and then we've got a gap. This sort of comes into this canine area here. Got some sharp edges here where there's the tooth missing. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of leave this tooth area here and come over here to the other eye. And you can use the smaller 45-degree angle lines, as I've talked about them before. The 45-degree angle being this. And then, so the socket has sort of a passage here, and then it curves and dips down. There's a little bit of the brow bone contouring going on right here. So I'm going to let that blend into this side over here just a little bit. Okay, now I'm squinting down and I'm observing inside this eye socket there's a passage of shadow that comes at about that triangular shape. So it's darker on this side. So I'm going to put a thin piece of value over this whole triangular shape, and then I'll push the darker passages a little bit more. So in here, I can clean up some of these edges. All right, and then there's these subtle little contouring shapes inside the socket, so we'll just suggest some of those. Looking at the distance of the corner of this eye socket down to the zygomatic edge here. And then this shoots back. About to here. And then I've got a dark passage in here. And some of this temporal bone sculpting in here. Again, using my pencil to help draw the contouring lines to define this form. You can let all of them sort of curve and turn in the way that you want to explain the form inside here. Okay, so coming down around a little bit more, I just want to soften this a little bit. And then the rest of the cranium comes back this way a little bit more. Okay, and then underneath this zygomatic bone we have, one of the tricks about working from life is to try very hard to not move very much. I mean, I'm moving my head to look back at the skull, but I don't want to move the rest of me because it can really alter how it all looks. Okay. So this skull does not have really excellent teeth, so I'm going to just sort of suggest them in place because they look kind of scary, kind of pointy and jagged. So I'm just going to put in a few. The canine is important, and that comes down like usually on right on the corners of the front of the mouth. So that is pretty much in place. I'm going to put in a few highlights right now just to help define some of these sharper points. We already got the bridge in here a little bit in place, so I'm going to just define a few more. And then the corner of this forehead of here has just a little highlight on it. A little bit of textural working in there. All right, well, beginning to draw this lion, I just set him up on my table at an angle that I thought was interesting. I knew I was going to want to focus primarily on his face and mane and paws. So everything else was going to be just a little more understated back there behind him, his body. I did want to suggest it. So starting with his face, I loved the contour of the forehead. So when you have a sculpture set up before you, or whatever it is you're drawing, look for the one area that really is motivating you to draw this item, and just start there. Everything else can kind of take a back seat. So in this case, if you had this lion before you and you wanted to draw it, if you were also inspired from his face and just his overall expression, then even if that was the only thing you drew, it would be a more successful drawing because you are isolating those areas that are important to you as an artist. So if you can just concentrate on conveying what you love about a subject, whether you're doing a painting, a plein air, a still life, a portrait, whatever it is you're doing, if you can convey to the viewer what moved you, then that's far more powerful than any kind of painting that may be super detailed or whatever. Tell us what you love, and that's where the poetry is. So in this case, I loved his face, and so that's where I'm starting. And that was the crux of every decision I made from here on out. I like, his big tail, how it wraps around and all this, but it wasn't essential for the telling of the story. So I'm starting with his face, and I'm using the background. You can see the brown of the table, how it, against his forehead, creates sort of that triangular shape back there. So I used that one edge of his face to help develop that contour by using the background. So now I'm working on the interior forms, placing the eye and the cheekbone and just different elements of the head inside there. this drawing I did with a little bit more different approach than I did with the woman, the marble sculpture from the museum. With that one, I started with a loose gestural sketch to get the overall grace and form of this. Since I knew that in this drawing, my primary focus was going to be on the lion's face, I decided instead of doing a big, loose, quick gestural start to the drawing, by just focusing on the angle and the interior features of the face, and then slowly working my way around, I thought that it might have a more interesting appeal, and I could stop when I felt that the thing I really wanted to convey was on the paper. So it's a little bit different approach, and I wanted to demonstrate a few different styles that you could use in approaching your drawing. With the skull, I started with the general placement of the eye sockets, and that's very similar to how we start a portrait. We start with the eyes, work our way down to the nose, then down to the mouth, then we work more on the contour of the outside of the face. And it's a little bit similar approach with what I did with this lion, except first I established the angle of the outside of his face, and then from there, with that as my truth, then I added the eye and the nose and the other features. So however you have to work it, as long as you establish your one element of truth prior to anything else, then you should be all set to branch off of there. In this passage in here where I'm working on the arm of the lion, I really wanted to try to capture the weight of his form being on that stone slab. So using my pencil, I just push a little bit harder to capture that. When working on something that is complicated, like this lion's mane, with all these different curves and different pieces of mane, what I want to do is start by establishing an overall value in certain passages. So if I'm squinting down at that line and I see that, for example, in this case, it's a little bit darker value back in there, I can just put a very thin layer of value on that, and then into that start sculpting out a little bit more of the hair chunks, and then pulling out some highlights. When I'm working out the perspective of this block that the lion is sitting on, I just look at the shapes that I see from exactly the angle that I'm looking at. So where his arm meets the top of that brick thing, to me it's a triangular shape. So I just draw that shape in, and then I look at where my vertical line drops down from that. And then what is the shape of the front of the block? And then I just draw it that way accordingly. Being that this is a white lion, the temptation is to cover the whole lion in white, but I also wanted to capture that appearance of it looking like an antique sculpture. So I did allow quite a bit of the cream color of the paper to show through, pulling out only the essential areas of brightest lights. So I just sort of chose on here how to continue on with this feeling of antiquity. So just popping in a few of the select places of highlights and remembering again that I wanted the primary focus to be on the lion's face. And then I let the white just sort of cascade off of the rest of him less and less as I went along. Okay, so that wraps up this week's lesson, and next week we are going to be starting our plaster cast drawing. We're going to spend 2 weeks on this. All right, we'll see you then.